The first scripture lesson is a series of verses lifted from the 104th Psalm. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for people to use, to bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine and bread to strengthen the human heart. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. These familiar words about Jesus in the wilderness, just the opening verses of the 4th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When Pat asked me to take one of these Wednesday evening services and asked if I would do the one on taste, I began thinking about what tastes I first associated with Union Presbyterian Church. Immediately, Mrs. LeClaire's spaghetti sauce came to mind. More to the point, to the salivary glands. When I was in the youth group back in the 1960s, one of the surefire fundraisers for the youth group was having spaghetti dinners in the then brand new fellowship hall. The place would be packed with church folks and with neighbors having spaghetti and meatballs. The place would be full of steam in the kitchen because of the water boiling and the pasta cooking and the sauce bubbling up. Rich, savory tomato sauce. The second taste that came to mind had still another connection. If you can imagine the taste of peppermint. It was another fundraising project for the youth group, and I can still see the stack of round green tin boxes that held mouth-watering mint candies, those melt-in-your-mouth little pillows that people enjoy. Now, the minty taste is a very pleasant memory. What's not so pleasant is associated with those 6 tins is Al Bombard's scowl when he persisted in asking for the money for the cans I had sold or didn't sell. I think I may have sold one to my parents, and then I'm sure I ate my way through the others and hoped that Al would forget the bookkeeping part of the project. He didn't, but the candy was fresh and minty enough that it would just open up your sinuses. And then to add one more liturgical taste to the blend, grape juice at communion. The bread was forgettable, tiny little white cubes of nondescript dough, but the grape juice was sweet and fruity and much appreciated as the 11 o'clock worship service passed that 12 o'clock mark, and David Cook and I, sitting way back there, began to feel our stomachs rumble. We would have been glad to drink anything, but when that little cup came by, it was wonderful. The sacrament was theologically beyond our reach, though, because my memory is that David and I got tickled, got giggling, got shaking in the pew giggling, picturing the minister's wife stomping on the grapes in her bare feet. But I digress. Those were the first tastes that I got of church as a kid. And now I've put away childish things, mostly, and I realize how significant food and drink are to the life and the fellowship of any Christian crowd apart from youth group fundraisers. The scriptures are full of references to the shared pallets and plates and pantries of the people of God. Bread, fruits, vegetables, dairy products were the staples of Israel, and of course of all of the other creatures of God as well. For the average Israelite, meat was a little bit beyond what they could afford, but it was designated for very special occasions and feasts. And we know there were lots of fish in the seas. Besides providing sustenance, though, food was connected with social bonding and relationships, just as it is today. Covenants were sometimes sealed with food, and people received food as wages or paid off debts with food. Food was an offering made to God and came to have rich symbolic and theological meaning for people. Look at the Seder, for example. Generation after generation, as Jews celebrate the Seder meal, tastes are both physical, real, but also symbolic and metaphorical. Wine, the symbol of joy and happiness. Karpas. Do you know karpas? Karpas refers to the vegetable, usually a boiled onion or potato, that's dipped in salt water, the salt water representing the tears of sadness of the people of Israel. Matzah is the bread of poverty. Bitter herbs remind those at the table of the tribulations of God's chosen people. And roasted eggs. Why eggs? A rabbi is said to have explained that the egg symbolizes the Jew, that the more an egg is burned or boiled, the harder it gets. We don't have to list all of the mentions of things to taste in the Bible, but I can summarize, noting that in the Hebrew scriptures there are references to rich wines, very much appreciated, but cautionary. Psalm 104, which I read, the Lord is praised for the gift of bringing forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the human heart, but not too much gladdening. We know of the land flowing with milk and honey. Take a moment. Honey. Of manna and berries and breads. And Isaiah's prophecy adds to these ingredients what salvation tastes like. On this mountain, the Lord all-powerful will prepare for all nations a feast of the finest foods. Choice wines and best meats will be served, though there is no mention of Mrs. LeClaire's spaghetti sauce for some reason. The menu isn't all that different in the New Testament. Lots of mentions of grains and wine again, and add some fish too. In fact, I've always loved that post-resurrection appearance of Jesus when the disciples have been out there fishing and Jesus calls them into the shore for his version of Doug's fish fry. But that's getting way ahead of the Lenten journey. Let's go back to Jesus in the wilderness, famished, coveting bread, and how quickly we read through those familiar verses about Jesus fasting without thinking about how he must have yearned to smell the rising dough, feel the texture of the warm bread, and taste the rich hunks of that which satisfies the hungry and fills the needy with especially good things. Of course, we do not need to be reminded that we do not live by bread alone, but we do live by bread. At the end of his time among us, it was bread dipped in sauce that identified to Jesus who his betrayer would be. Back to the wine. Remember early on in his ministry, Jesus produced the finest wine at this wedding feast in Cana in Galilee. And after just one taste, the steward announced that it was the best that had been offered. And then at the end of his ministry, on the night when he was betrayed, he poured and shared wine among his disciples at that Last Supper and we still share in that cup of the new covenant of his blood line. On the cross, the taste was that of vinegar offered on a sponge. Throughout his ministry, Jesus ate and drank with all kinds and was roundly criticized for it. The religious elite didn't like that he ate with sinners or that his disciples would munch on bits of grain on the Sabbath. Jesus was even accused of gluttony and drunkenness. So often did he find himself enjoying food and drink with all the saints and sinners whom he loved. And now look at us, his modern-day sinning and saintly disciples. We can barely show up at church without munching, lunching, and crunching our way through. It's obvious that the place of food in our lives is more than just digestible sustenance. Our mere consumption of meals and snacks and the liquids that wash them down contribute to the strength of a community spirit and a sense of fellowship. Sacramentally, yes, we have our Holy Communion, but even in so-called secular settings, we find something of the sacred when we share a meal. Remember that book, Eat, Pray, Love? When visiting Italy, the author Elizabeth Gilbert helps prepare a birthday meal for her friend Luca. His birthday coincides with the American Thanksgiving Day, which the author describes as a day of grace and thanks and community and, yes, pleasure. An American friend, Deborah, and several others gather at the table, and after several bottles of Sardinian wine, Deborah introduces the table to the suggestion that they follow a nice American custom by joining hands and each, in turn, saying what they're most grateful for. In 3 languages, then, this montage of gratitude spills forth, one testimony at a time. In that brief excerpt, we find what one might describe as a spiritual meal, full of ritual, requisite wine, hand-holding, personal testimony, and communion, yet by no means a formal religious feast as defined by doctrine or religious law. While the context of that particular meal may have been secular, the elements of food and fellowship provided an experience that fed the spirit as well as the body. I used to go to a Trappist monastery for a week each summer as part of my continuing education. I would sit at table at the guest house of the Holy Cross Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Berryville, Virginia, with 6 other retreatants gathered round the table and Father Stephen Usinowitz at the head of the table. After Father Stephen had offered a prayer of thanksgiving to God for the food we were about to enjoy from the bounty of God's creation, he stabbed his fork into his vegetarian salad and then encouraged the rest of us to pass this large platter of roast beef around the table. The meat had come quite freshly from beef cattle that the monks raised on their 1,200-acre farm along the Shenandoah River. Stephen abstained from meat, following the 6th century rule of St. Benedict. Except the sick who are very weak, let all abstain entirely from eating the flesh of 4-footed animals, Benedict wrote. Yet the monk's livelihood came from raising beef for others to eat. Stephen's traditions included spiritual fasting as well as observing Roman Catholic feasts. As the lone Presbyterian at the table those days, my own eating habits were less guided by religious, ritual, or health issues, even conscience, than by simply having a physical appetite. Well, a lot of things have changed in the 35 years since I ate there. The monks found that raising cattle was less than profitable in this day and age, and they even stopped baking monastery bread, though they used the ovens for brandy-fueled fruitcake production to support their ministry as monks. And I'm far more aware that the food I choose to eat not only impacts my health directly, but has profound ramifications for the health of the planet, as we discussed in our Sunday school class this past week. as well as the health of global neighbors. I've also come to value the rhythms of feasting and fasting that help pace a person's spiritual journey. One thing that has not changed in those days, when I look back to that monastery meal, is that though from different ecclesiastical traditions we could share around that table, but we could not share around the table of Christ, that Holy Communion meal. The Protestants were not welcome at the table. So we could only enjoy the aroma of the bread and the wine, not the taste. Still, there was a sense of spiritual union and fellowship around the dinner table, and we were thankful for that because friendships were created there and nurtured in the context of tables set and plates passed, food tasted and appreciated, and then dishes washed by hand. Had a Buddhist joined us at that table, he or she would have shared in the salad but not the beef. Had a Jew joined us at the table, they would have enjoyed the beef, but they would have passed on the pork had it been offered. And a Taoist might have cautioned all of us with words from the Tao Te Ching. To take all one wants is never so good as to stop when someone should. Well, enough said. Let's share in a tasteful experience of communion, not the church's sacrament, but the building of fellowship among those who have this in common, that we have heard the exhortation to taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste as in try, test, sample the Lord's presence and see how good it is that we are together and that God is here among us. But lest we forget that the literal gift of taste with which the Lord has endowed us is what we celebrate on this evening, I invite you to come to this table and take a small item that represents some biblical things like the wonder of fresh bread, and it's not wonder bread, it's fresh bread, the sweetness of grapes, currently on sale at a local supermarket, and a food that escaped the Bible, but not us, dark chocolate. I invite you to take a sample of one, or take two, or three, and then go back to your pew and sample them one at a time. If you've taken a piece of chocolate, just open it up. By the way, it is dark chocolate and it is liturgically wrapped in purple. Enjoy the taste of that. Don't just gobble it down, chew it, swallow it, it's gone. Enjoy the taste. There are grapes there, 2 or 3 together. Eat them one at a time and savor them. And for the bread, there's a cloth there. You can break off a piece. We're not talking about communion. We're talking about a hunk of bread, which you should enjoy for as long as that bread lasts. And if it doesn't, I happen to have another loaf. I invite you to taste and to really, truly, thoughtfully, and prayerfully enjoy these foods, savor them, and then give thanks to God for the pleasure that comes from God's good earth and God's loving grace.